When I was 23, I did a solo camping trip around 3 lakes in the same county, just me, a 2-person tent I didn't need the extra space for, and about 4 days of food packed a little too optimistically. This was the second lake on my route, a smaller one, not on a lot of maps, the kind of place where the campground host just waves you through the gate and doesn't bother writing your plate number down. I picked a site close to the water because I liked the idea of falling asleep to it. The site next to mine was empty the whole time I was there, and so was the one after that, which in hindsight should have told me something about how popular this particular stretch of shoreline actually was with regulars. The campground itself was maybe a third full at most, other sites scattered around the far side near the entrance, which I remember being grateful for at the time, thinking I'd lucked into the quiet, private end of the loop. The host was an older guy, maybe 70, grey beard, the kind of quiet that made you think he'd said everything he needed to say a long time ago, and just hadn't found a reason to talk much since. He told me one thing when I checked in, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mention where the bathrooms were. He said if I heard someone calling my name from the water at night, don't answer, and don't go down to the shore. I laughed a little, said something like noted, and he didn't laugh back, which I chalked up to just being an old guy thing, the way some of them like to play it serious for the tourists. I didn't think about it again. Not that night anyway. The first 2 nights were fine. Genuinely, almost boringly fine. Loons calling back and forth across the water. Wind moving through the pines. One raccoon that got into my food bag on night 1. Which honestly was my own fault for not hanging it properly. I remember thinking, on night 2, lying there listening to the water lap against the little strip of gravel beach, that this was exactly the kind of trip I'd wanted. Quiet, simple nothing, weird about it at all. There was one small thing on night 2 I brushed off completely at the time, and only really thought about later. Sometime after I'd gone to bed, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside my tent, slow, deliberate, the kind of pace a person walks at when they're not in any hurry. Circle around the whole perimeter once, and then stop. I figured it was the host doing a late check of the sites, or another camper who'd wandered over from a further loop by mistake. I never heard them walk away again afterward, but I also fell asleep before I thought to worry about that detail, and in the morning there weren't any footprints in the gravel at all. Not mine, not anyone else's, which I chalked up to the ground being too hard-packed to hold a print in the first place. On the 3rd night I woke up around 2 in the morning, and I want to describe exactly what woke me up, because it wasn't a sound. It was the absence of one. I don't mean quiet like peaceful. I mean the specific kind of quiet where you realize, half a second before your brain catches up, that the crickets have stopped, the water's stopped lapping, and you can't hear a single bird anywhere in the woods around you. I lay there for what felt like a full minute, just listening to nothing, waiting for my ears to be wrong about it. They weren't wrong. And then I heard my name, clear as anything, from the direction of the water, maybe 30 or 40 feet from my tent. A female voice, which struck me as strange even in the moment, because I hadn't told a single soul the exact site number I'd ended up at, hadn't even known it myself, until I pulled in, and the only people who knew my actual full name and roughly where I was that week were about 200 miles away, asleep in their own beds. I did the thing you do, where you try to talk yourself down. I told myself it was probably someone else camping nearby, a coincidence, some other person with my name having their own weird 2 a.m. moment somewhere out past the tree line. I actually whispered that to myself, out loud, in my tent, like saying it was going to make it more true. It called my name 2 more times. Same distance, same direction, never closer, never farther, like whatever was making the sound had picked a spot and was staying planted in it on purpose. Between the second and third time, I heard something I still don't have a good word for. A dragging sound, but wet, heavier than it should have been. Like something being pulled slow across gravel that was still partly underwater. I ran through every explanation I could think of, lying flat on my back, with my heart going way too fast for how still I was staying. A person playing a prank, but nobody knew I was there. An animal that could somehow mimic speech. I've read about a few that supposedly can, but never one that could say a full 2-syllable name that clean, that clearly. A recording somebody had rigged up as a joke, but there was no laughter after, no follow-up, nothing that a prank usually needs to land. None of it held together long enough to actually calm me down. I even, for a second, tried to convince myself the whole thing was some elaborate setup by the host himself. Some local legend he performed for gullible solo campers to keep the story alive. But that didn't fit either, because he'd have had to know I was awake, had to time it perfectly to the exact minute I stirred, and there was no way for him to have known that from wherever he was. The dragging sound came one more time while I was running through all of this, closer to the tree line than the water this time, like it had come up out of the lake entirely and was now moving along the shore parallel to my tent instead of toward it. That was somehow worse than if it had come straight at me. It meant it wasn't just calling and waiting, it was looking. I did not go look. I want to be honest that I have never in my life wanted less to unzip a tent flap. I put my headphones in, turned the music up loud enough to drown everything else out, and did not fall back asleep. Not really. Just lay there with my eyes shut until the light started coming up grey through the tent fabric. In the morning I packed up faster than I needed to and told the host I was heading out a day early. He just nodded, like he'd already guessed why, and said yeah, that happens some nights, in the exact same flat tone he'd used to warn me in the first place. Not what happened, not are you okay, just that happens some nights, like it was weather. I never went back to that lake. I still don't know whose voice that was, or what it wanted with a name it had no business knowing, or why it stopped the instant the light came up, and not 1 second before. I worked night security at a marina for about 8 months during college, mostly just walking the docks every couple of hours, making sure nobody was messing with the boats, checking that the gate was locked, logging anything unusual in a little notebook nobody ever actually read back. It was a boring job by design, and I liked it that way. I could read on my phone for 6 hours and get paid for it, which at 20 was close enough to a dream job. The marina itself was mid-sized, maybe 60 slips total, mostly sailboats and a handful of pontoons owned by retirees who came out on weekends. The kind of place where nothing ever really happened, and the biggest incident on record before I started was somebody's dinghy coming untied in a storm. There was one boat slip, number 14, that had been empty the entire time I worked there. No boat, just a rope tied off to nothing, coiled loose on the dock like it used to be attached to something that had simply stopped existing. I asked the day manager about it once, on a shift overlap, mostly out of idle curiosity. He said, "Owner stopped coming around. We haven't had the heart to reassign it," and then changed the subject fast enough that I figured there was a longer story behind it I wasn't getting the full version of. I let it go, the way you do with things that aren't really your business. About 2 months into the job, I started noticing the rope on slip 14 was untied some nights. Not fallen loose, not tangled by wind, untied, deliberately, draped over the dock post like someone had loosened the knot on purpose and left it that way. I'd retie it on my rounds without thinking much of it. Figured maybe local kids came out and messed with things when I wasn't watching that section closely. Then I started noticing it was retied into a different knot than the one I'd left. I'm not exaggerating that detail. I tie a simple cleat hitch, that's what they trained all the guards on. Easy, standard. Some mornings I'd walk past slip 14 and find it retied into something more complicated, tighter, layered, the kind of knot someone who actually knew boats would tie without thinking about it. I'm not a boat person. Nobody on staff was, as far as I knew. I asked the other night guy, the one who covered the shifts I didn't, if he was messing with it as some kind of joke. He said no, flat, no hesitation, and then went quiet in a way that made me not want to push it further. Eventually, he admitted, he tried to avoid that whole section of dock after midnight, if he could help it, and route his rounds to hit it earlier in the shift instead. I remember thinking that was a strange thing for a grown man to just casually admit out loud, like it embarrassed him a little to say, but he needed someone else to know. Around the same time, I started finding the gate log, the clipboard we kept at the security booth, where anyone entering after hours was supposed to sign in, with an extra line written in on nights I knew for a fact nobody had come through. Just a single signature, illegible, always in the same slot, always dated correctly for that night, always written in handwriting that didn't match anyone on staff, including the day guys I eventually asked about it. Management assumed it was a prank by one of the boat owners with a gate code, and didn't investigate further. I stopped being so sure once I lined the dates up against the nights the rope on slip 14 had been untied, and found they matched every single time, down to the exact date, never once off by even a day. I brought the clipboard up to the day manager directly once, laid the pattern out for him plainly, and watched his face change in a way that told me he already knew something about it he wasn't planning to share with a college kid working nights for minimum wage. He told me to stop worrying about the logbook and focus on my rounds, which I did, mostly, though I kept photographing the signature every time it showed up after that, just in case it ever mattered to have proof. There was also the matter of the temperature. Every marina worker knows the water near the boat ramp runs a couple degrees warmer than the water further out, something about the shallower depth and the concrete holding heat. Slip 14 was on the shallow side too, should have followed the same pattern, but every time I dipped a hand in near that particular slip on my rounds, just out of habit more than anything, it ran noticeably colder than everywhere else along the same stretch of dock, cold enough that I stopped doing it after the third or fourth time, just because it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. One night, a little after 3 a.m, doing my normal loop, I heard water moving under slip 14 specifically. Not the general slap of the lake against the pilings you get everywhere along the marina, but something more contained, a controlled disturbance, like something was treading water directly beneath the empty slip and staying more or less in place while it did it. I stood there for probably a full minute just listening to it not stop. I ran the logic in my head, same as anyone would. Current, but the marina was sheltered. The water inside the breakwater barely moved even in a storm. Wind. The flag on the office pole was completely still that night. I remember checking it specifically because I wanted an explanation, and it didn't give me one. A fish, a beaver, something ordinary, but the sound had a rhythm to it I couldn't make fit anything I knew. Steady, even, in, pause, out, almost like breathing, if breathing could happen underwater and take its time doing it. I didn't go check. I finished the rest of my loop, giving that section of dock a much wider berth than usual, and I radioed the office to say I wasn't feeling well and needed to cut the shift short. Nobody questioned it. I got the sense, looking back, that I wasn't the first guard to make that exact call on a night shift there, and probably wouldn't be the last either. In the 2 weeks between that night and when I finally quit, I made a point of doing my rounds with the other guard whenever our shifts happened to overlap, and neither of us ever said out loud why we'd started doing that. We just started doing it. On my second to last shift, I finally worked up the nerve to shine my flashlight straight down into the water under slip 14 instead of walking past it. There wasn't anything there that I could see, just dark water, a little murkier than the rest of the marina for some reason, and my own reflection breaking apart on the surface where the treading motion had been happening for weeks. I stood there a long moment anyway, waiting for it to start again while I was actually looking. It didn't, not that night, and somehow that was almost worse than if it had. I quit that job about 3 weeks later, gave some vague excuse about my class schedule changing that nobody pushed back on. I never did find out what happened to whoever used to own slip 14, or why the day manager wouldn't say it straight out, or why the other guard already had a whole avoidance routine built around a section of dock he'd never fully explained to me. The rope's probably still sitting there tonight, tied in someone else's knot, waiting for the next person whose job it is to walk past it. My husband and I bought our first house 2 years ago, a little place on a private lake, the kind with maybe 40 homes total, ringing the whole shoreline, mostly older couples, and a handful of families like it had been that way for decades, and nobody saw a reason to change it. We got it for a good price, which in hindsight is always a detail worth paying more attention to than it gets at the time. The realtor mentioned the sellers were motivated, an older couple relocating to be closer to their kids, and nothing about the disclosure paperwork raised any flags for either of us, or for the inspector we hired, who walked the whole property, including the boathouse, without noting a single issue worth mentioning. The house came with a boathouse down near the water, small, single slip, mostly used for storage by the previous owners based on what was left behind. Some old life jackets going stiff with age, a rusted tackle box, a paddle with a crack running most of its length. Nothing dramatic. We didn't think much of it beyond needing to clean it out eventually. About a month in, I started noticing the boathouse door was open in the mornings. We kept it padlocked, always, because my husband is that particular kind of careful, where he checks locks twice out of habit. The first time I found it open, I figured I just hadn't locked it right the night before. My own mistake. The second time, though, the padlock was still locked, closed, hanging exactly where it should be, but the door was open anyway, standing ajar like someone had gone in and out through a door that, by every physical explanation I had, shouldn't have been able to open at all, with the lock still engaged. Around that same time, the old tackle box the previous owners had left behind started showing up in different spots inside the boathouse from where we'd left it. We'd set it on the shelf against the back wall, and a few mornings later it would be sitting on the floor near the door instead, lid closed. Nothing missing from inside it, as far as we could tell. Just relocated a few feet, like someone had picked it up to look at it, and set it back down somewhere else entirely. We had the boathouse door replaced not long after. New hardware, new hinges, new lock, the works, on the theory that maybe the old mechanism had some flaw we weren't seeing. The locksmith who installed it actually commented, unprompted, that the old strike plate had scratch marks on the inside face that didn't match a key being used normally. More consistent, he said, with someone working the mechanism from the inside out rather than the outside in, which didn't make sense for a door that was supposed to keep people out, not in. It happened again within the week, same locked but open contradiction. And that's when I stopped assuming it was a mechanical thing. Around that same stretch of weeks, I started noticing the water level marks on the boathouse pilings looked wrong some mornings. A clear line, higher than it should have been given the lake's actual level that day, like the water had risen noticeably overnight and then dropped back down before I got out there to check it in daylight. My husband said I was reading too much into normal fluctuation, wind pushing water up against the pilings, that sort of thing. I let it go for a while because I didn't have a good way to argue with normal fluctuation that didn't sound unhinged out loud. I finally started keeping a small notebook of my own, nothing formal, just a running log of the waterline each morning against a strip of duct tape I'd stuck on the piling as a rough marker. Over about 6 weeks, the line came in noticeably higher than the tape 11 separate mornings, always a similar amount, always gone back down to normal by the time my husband checked it after breakfast. Like whatever caused it knew exactly how long it had before he'd be awake enough to look for himself. Then there was a night I woke up to a sound from down near the water that I can only describe as something heavy being set down gently, twice, with a pause in between, like someone was being careful not to make noise and mostly succeeding. I didn't go look that night either. I just lay there next to my husband, who slept through all of it, and listened until it stopped on its own. Around the same stretch of time, our motion sensor porch light, which faces the boathouse directly, started tripping at almost the same time every night, somewhere close to 11:30, for exactly a few seconds before shutting itself back off. I checked the camera footage from our doorbell once, curious more than scared at that point, and there was nothing in frame when it tripped. No deer, no raccoon, nothing crossing in front of the sensor at all, which the installer later told me shouldn't be possible given how the sensor was calibrated. He offered to come recalibrate it. I told him not to bother, because some part of me didn't actually want it fixed if fixing it meant not knowing when 11:30 had come around again. The thing that actually got to me, more than any of it, was smaller than all of that put together. We found a single wet footprint on the boathouse floorboards one morning. Just one, bare, adult-sized, facing toward the house like whatever made it had come up out of the water and taken exactly one step before stopping cold. No trail of prints leading up to it from the water's edge. No trail leading away from it back toward anything. Just the one print, drying slowly in the morning air by the time I got a picture of it on my phone, and gone entirely by the time I brought my husband down to see it for himself 20 minutes later. I went through every explanation I could think of, out loud, mostly to myself. A neighbour's kid messing around and only leaving one footprint because he was careful about it, but there was no way in or out that wouldn't have left a second track somewhere. An animal, but it had toes, it had an arch, a heel. It was unmistakably a human foot, and nothing else. Condensation, doing something strange on the wood grain. I've thought about that one the longest, and it still doesn't hold up once you've actually seen it in person, up close, with your own eyes. About 4 months after the footprint, I found a second one, on the exact same floorboard, facing the exact same direction. I hadn't told anyone outside my husband about the first one, hadn't posted about it anywhere, hadn't even mentioned it to our closest neighbour, so I know it wasn't some elaborate prank being run on us over a season. Same size, same shape, same single, unaccompanied step, like whatever left it had come back to check something and found it exactly the way it left it the first time. We still live there. The door thing still happens maybe once a month, less predictable than I'd like, more predictable than I'd like it to not be at all. We've mostly stopped commenting on it to each other when it happens, which I know sounds like acceptance, but it's closer to just not wanting to say it out loud again and make it more real than it already feels. I check the boathouse every morning now, before my husband's even awake, just so that if there's ever another footprint, I'm the one who sees it first, and I still haven't decided if that's protective, or just something I've talked myself into needing to do, some small ritual that makes the mornings feel a little more like mine. We used to visit my grandparents' lake house every summer growing up, same week in July, same bunk bed in the same back room every single year without fail. This is from the summer I was 14, so it's about a decade ago at this point. But it's one of those memories that hasn't gone soft and fuzzy the way most of that age tends to for me. My grandpa had one rule that none of the grandkids ever questioned, because he was the kind of guy you just didn't argue with. No swimming after the dinner bell rang, no exceptions, didn't matter how hot it was outside or how much he'd been looking forward to a night swim all day. He never really explained it beyond "that's just when you don't go in," said in a tone that closed the conversation before it opened, and at 14 I didn't care enough to push on it any further than that. We had a big extended family, cousins scattered across 3 different households, all converging on the same lake house that same week every summer, so there were usually 6 or 7 of us kids running around at any given time. But that particular evening, it had just been the 2 of us down at the dock, everyone else already inside, for one reason or another. That particular summer, my cousin and I were down at the dock a little after the dinner bell had already rung, not swimming, technically, just sitting on the edge with our feet in the water, because it was humid and miserable out, and the water felt good against our ankles. We weren't breaking the actual rule, we told each other, more than once, like we needed to keep confirming it between ourselves. About 10 minutes into sitting there, my cousin pointed out that the water around our feet had gone completely still, glassy almost. even though there'd been a light chop across the rest of the lake the entire evening, visible clear as day just a little further out past the end of the dock. Just around us it had gone flat and smooth like glass. Neither of us said anything for a second, just looked at it. Right before the stillness settled in, I remember the bugs going quiet too, all at once, the same way they had every single evening that week, right around full dark. Except this time it happened a little earlier than usual, like something had cut it off ahead of schedule. My cousin noticed it too, and made some joke about it, and neither of us thought much of it in the moment, too distracted by how nice the water felt against our ankles to really register it as a warning sign. Then something touched the bottom of my foot. Not a brush, not a fish nibble, a deliberate touch, a single finger dragged once along my heel, and then gone. Unmistakable in a way that's hard to explain to someone who wasn't there to feel it. It wasn't cold the way you'd expect lake water brushing your skin to feel. Either, if anything, it felt warmer than the water around it, which is a detail I've never been able to make sense of, no matter how many times I've turned it over since. I yanked my feet up out of the water so fast, I nearly went backward off the dock entirely. My cousin swore, right there in the moment, and still to this day, that the exact same thing happened to her about 2 seconds later. Same foot, same spot near the heel. We didn't wait around to compare notes any further. We booked it back up the hill to the house, and my grandpa took one look at the two of us coming through the screen door and just said, "Dinner bell already rang," in a tone that made it clear he already knew exactly why we looked the way we did, without either of us saying a word. I asked him, right there, breathing hard, why we weren't allowed in the water after the bell. He looked at my grandma first, like he was checking whether he was even allowed to answer that in front of us, and she just gave this small nod, barely anything. Then he said, "Your Uncle Ray used to say the same thing you're about to tell me when he was your age, and I told him the same thing I'm telling you now. You don't go in after the bell, and you don't ask twice." I remember my mum standing near the kitchen doorway through all of this, not saying a word either, just watching my grandpa with an expression I couldn't fully read at 14, but have thought about a lot since. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like she'd half expected this conversation to land on one of us eventually, and was almost relieved it hadn't been her having to explain it. That was it. That was the entire explanation he was willing to give. My Uncle Ray died before I was born. A car accident. Nothing to do with the lake as far as anyone in the family has ever told me, so I still don't fully understand what the connection was supposed to be, or if my grandpa even meant for there to be one at all, beyond a warning passed down the way families sometimes pass warnings down without the reasons attached anymore. For a couple of summers after that, I noticed my grandpa standing out on the porch some evenings, right around when the dinner bell would normally ring, just watching the water for a minute before he actually rang it, like he was checking something first. I never asked him what he was looking for, and he never volunteered it, and eventually I stopped noticing him doing it, though I've wondered since whether he just got better at not being seen, or whether he genuinely stopped. We kept visiting every summer after that, same week, same bunk bed. I never sat on that dock again after the dinner bell, not once, and neither did my cousin, not even years later, when we were both old enough to know better, and still didn't test it. My grandpa passed a few years back, and my grandma still lives at the house alone most of the year, and last summer when I visited, I finally asked her, just the two of us on the porch, if she knew any more than what he told us that night. She thought about it for a while before she answered, long enough that I almost took the question back. Stirring her coffee slower than the coffee actually needed. Then she just said that the rule had come with the house when they bought it, told to them by the family who'd sold it, and that she'd never once heard a reason attached to it beyond "you'll understand if you ever hear it for yourself," which nobody in our family, as far as she knew, ever had, until my cousin and I did. We just don't bring it up when we're together now, not directly, though sometimes one of us will mention the dock, and the other one will just go quiet for a second, in a way that says the memory's still exactly where we left it. This is the longest one I've got tonight, and it comes from 4 friends who rented a lake house together for a summer between college and whatever came after, the way you do when you're 22 and think you have more time than you actually have before real life starts asking for its share. The house was a rental, cheap for the area, and the listing had mentioned almost nothing about the lake itself beyond a single line about private dock access, which in hindsight should have been the first flag, because usually lake rentals lead with the lake, and this one barely mentioned it at all, like the listing agent wanted the water to be an afterthought rather than a selling point. One of the girls even joked about it during the walkthrough, asked the property manager outright why the photos barely showed the dock, and got a vague answer about liability reasons nobody pressed further on, too excited about the house to care about the fine print. The 4 of them, 2 guys, 2 girls, all friends since freshman year of college, moved in for what was supposed to be a 10-week stretch. The first 2 weeks were exactly what you'd picture. Cookouts most nights, a fire pit that stayed lit way later than it should have, way too much time spent floating around on cheap inflatables, doing absolutely nothing productive with their days. Nobody thought about the lake as anything more than the reason they'd picked this house over the others they'd looked at. The seed of it started small, almost too small to mention. One of the girls, we'll just say she was the one who noticed things first, always had been, the type of person who remembers exactly where she left her keys 3 days ago. Mentioned that the dock had 13 wooden slats when they first moved in. She'd counted them idly on the first day, the way you count stairs without meaning to. One morning about 10 days in, she counted 12. Nobody believed her at first, because who actually counts dock slats? But she was annoyed enough by their skepticism to go back down and recount it twice more that same day. 12. Both times, she let it go, because what else do you do with a missing plank of wood that nobody remembers being removed? The false calm lasted almost 3 more weeks after that. Genuinely good weeks, the kind people romanticize for years afterward, someone's birthday, a couple of parties that spilled out onto the lawn, long afternoons where nothing happened and nothing needed to. Then the anomalies started stacking, one on top of the next, close enough together that they became impossible to write off individually. First, it was the dock light, motion activated, which started clicking on in the middle of the night, with nobody outside to trip it, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times in a single night, always for exactly a few seconds, before shutting itself back off, like whatever was setting it off wasn't standing still long enough to keep it lit, moving in and out of range fast. Then one of the guys found his fishing gear, which he kept stored in the boathouse, completely rearranged one morning, not stolen, not scattered, but laid out in a perfectly straight line along the dock, evenly spaced, piece by piece, like someone had taken real care and real time to arrange it exactly that way. He assumed one of his roommates was messing with him and said so directly. All three of the others swore up and down it wasn't them, and by the way they said it, genuinely seemed rattled that he'd even think to ask. Around that same stretch, all four of them started independently noticing the lake going dead silent at almost the exact same time each night, somewhere close to 1 in the morning. No bugs, no water sound, nothing at all, for a stretch of maybe 2 or 3 minutes before everything picked back up like normal, all at once, like a switch being flipped back on. The first person to bring it up over breakfast one morning assumed she was the only one who'd noticed it happening. By the time all four of them actually compared notes properly, sitting around the kitchen table with their coffee going cold, every single one of them had independently clocked the exact same window of silence on separate nights, without ever mentioning it to each other until then. Then came the night the smoke alarm went off in the bedroom closest to the water. At 1 in the morning, no smoke anywhere, nothing wrong with the wiring or the battery when they checked it thoroughly the next day. Right as the alarm went off, one of the guys who happened to already be awake swore he saw someone standing at the very end of the dock through his window, just standing there, not moving at all. A silhouette and nothing more, gone entirely by the time he grabbed his phone to try to get a light on it. They talked themselves through every rational explanation over the following couple of days, the way you do when you don't actually want to believe the thing you already believe deep down. Raccoons for the rearranged fishing gear, the neighbour's dog setting off the motion light every time it wandered too close, bad wiring finally for the smoke alarm, even after the electrician found nothing wrong. Someone's overactive imagination for the figure on the dock, easiest of all to dismiss on its own. None of it held together once you tried to stack all four things on top of each other and pretend they were separate. Unrelated coincidences happening in the exact same 2-week window on the exact same 40 feet of shoreline. The actual worst night came near the end of week 7. 3 of them were up late on the back porch, half watching a movie none of them were really paying attention to, and the 4th, the one who'd first counted the dock slats, had gone down to the water alone around midnight. Just to sit, she said afterward, because she liked the quiet down there better than the porch. The other 3 lost track of exactly how long she'd been gone, until the porch went dead silent the way the lake always did around 1 in the morning, except this time it didn't stop after the usual 2 or 3 minutes. It just stayed silent. No bugs, no water, nothing at all, stretching on far longer than it ever had before. They went down to check on her and found her sitting exactly where she'd been the whole time, facing straight out at the water, completely still, not responding at all when they said her name, once, then twice, then with real panic in their voices the 3rd time. When she finally turned around to look at them, according to all 3 of them independently and consistently even years later, the first thing she said, in a totally flat voice that none of them recognized as hers, was, "It's been counting the slats too." She wouldn't explain what she meant by it that night. She still never fully explained it, even years later. Even after a few drinks with old friends who love her and would never judge whatever answer she finally gave. They finished the summer out anyway, Nobody wanted to eat the security deposit by breaking the lease early, and by that point, they'd half convinced themselves it was some kind of collective stress thing. 4 people feeding off each other's nerves in an isolated house near water. The mind doing what minds do under pressure. The dock light kept clicking on with nothing there, right up until the last week they stayed. The lake kept going silent around 1 a.m, right up until the day they finally packed up and left for good. None of them have ever gone back to that lake, not even to drive past it on the highway that runs near it. And to this day, if you ask any of the 3 what she meant that night on the dock, they'll all give you the exact same answer without hesitating. They don't know. And they've stopped asking her directly, because the one time someone pushed her on it a few years back, over dinner, she just went quiet in a way that made everyone at the table immediately wish they hadn't brought it up at all. I fish alone a lot, mostly early mornings before work, and I've had my share of weird nothing moments out on the water over the years that turn out to be exactly that, nothing. A log that looks like something else in bad light. A bird call that sounds wrong for half a second before your brain sorts it out. This one didn't turn out to be nothing, or at least I never got the chance to find out that it was, because I didn't stick around long enough to let it finish whatever it was doing. I was out on a lake I fish maybe twice a month, in my kayak, well before sunrise, because that's when the fish are actually biting, and also because I genuinely like having the water to myself before the world wakes up. This particular morning was foggy, low and thick right on the surface of the water, the kind where you can still see stars clearly straight above you, but nothing more than 15 feet out across the lake in any direction, like the fog had decided to stay exactly at eye level and nowhere else. I'd fished through fog plenty of times before without thinking twice about it, so I didn't hesitate putting in that morning. Didn't even consider turning around and coming back later once the sun burned it off, like I probably should have, in hindsight, given everything that happened over the next hour or so out on that water. About 40 minutes in, nothing biting yet. I heard something surface off to my left, a good distance out past, where I could actually see. Not a splash exactly, more like something breaking the surface slow and controlled, almost gentle. The complete opposite of a fish jumping, more like something choosing to come up quietly on purpose, taking its time about it. The fog itself seemed to thicken right around where the sound had come from, more than it should have given there wasn't any wind to push it around and settle it unevenly like that, which I noticed, and then talked myself out of noticing almost in the same breath. I told myself it was a beaver or a big carp doing that lazy roll they sometimes do near the surface on calm mornings. I actually said it out loud to myself, which I'll admit I do sometimes when I'm alone out there, just to hear a voice, even my own, break up the quiet a little. It happened twice more over the next 15 minutes, each time a little closer than the last, each time from a slightly different angle relative to my kayak, like whatever it was circling me slowly, patiently, in the fog where I couldn't see it doing it. I started reeling my line in slower and slower, watching the wall of fog instead of watching my rod tip the way I normally would. Somewhere in there I noticed my line had gone taut without a bite registering on the rod itself, like something had brushed against it under the surface rather than struck it. And when I reeled the last bit in, the last few feet of line were coated in something slick that wasn't quite like any algae I'd pulled off a hook before. Thinner, almost slimy, in a way that didn't wash off my fingers as easily as it should have. I remember wiping my hand on my shirt 3 or 4 times, and still feeling like it hadn't come all the way off. I ran through the logic out loud, quiet, mostly to keep myself calm. Big fish don't surface like that, don't hold that kind of controlled, deliberate motion, carp roll and splash. They don't glide up and back down without a sound. Beavers slap the water hard when they're startled. They don't ease up gently and circle. There was nothing else that size that belonged in that particular lake, as far as I knew. Having fished it a dozen times before, with nothing remotely like this ever happening on any of those trips. The one detail I can't explain away, and believe me, I've tried more times than I'd like to admit. Lying awake some nights turning it over, right before the last time I heard it surface, I heard something that sounded almost exactly like breathing. Slow and deep, coming from close enough that it should have been visible even through fog that thick, if the fog had let up for even a second. Not a splash, not gurgling water settling. Breathing. In. A pause. Then out. Unhurried, like whatever was doing it had all the time in the world, and knew I didn't. I didn't wait around to find out what it was. I paddled back toward the launch faster than I've ever paddled in my life, not looking behind me once, because some part of my brain, some old animal part, said looking behind me was exactly the wrong move to make right then. I heard it surface one more time, further out this time, right as I finally hit the dock and hauled the kayak up onto the gravel launch, without even bothering to keep my feet dry in the process. Sitting in my truck afterward, engine running, heat on even though it wasn't cold out, I noticed my hands were shaking too much to get my seatbelt latched on the first 2 tries, which is not something that had ever happened to me on that lake before. Not even the time a storm rolled in faster than the forecast said it would, and I'd had to fight a real headwind to get back to shore. I still fish that lake sometimes, but never before sunrise anymore, and never, ever when there's fog sitting low on the water like that. For a while I told myself I'd just gotten spooked by something ordinary, and my imagination had filled in the rest overnight, the way it does, and I almost convinced myself of that right up until I mentioned it to a few other regulars, guys I've run into at the launch over the years, who fish that same stretch of shoreline as often as I do. Most of them just shrugged it off, said the lake plays tricks on you in the fog, and left it at that, the way people do when they'd rather not think too hard about a question. One guy, older, a lot more weathered than the rest, didn't shrug at all. He just looked at me for a second, long enough that I started to feel like I'd said something I shouldn't have, and said, "Yeah, I know the sound you mean," and didn't offer anything else past that. When I asked him if he still fished that same spot, he said he did, just never before first light anymore either, and never in the fog, and left it right there without another word, like we'd reached some kind of understanding that didn't need saying out loud. I've since started keeping a small mental checklist before I put in at that lake, clear sky, sun already up or close to it, no fog forecast anywhere in the county, and if any one of those 3 isn't true, I just don't go, no matter how good the bite's supposed to be that morning. It's cost me a few good fishing days over the past couple years. I've never once regretted it. I've been on a volunteer search and rescue team for our county for about 6 years now, mostly land searches for lost hikers, but we cover water incidents too, whenever the fire department needs extra hands on a shoreline. This one's from a call-out about 2 years back, a reported missing swimmer at a lake on the far side of the county, one I hadn't personally worked before, way out past where most of our usual call-outs happen. We got there right at dusk, which is never ideal for water search, but the call had come in late in the afternoon, and command wanted eyes on the shoreline before it went fully dark. The lake itself was bigger than most we covered, ringed by dense forest on 3 sides with only a couple of access points, which meant our search area for the night was going to be limited to whatever stretch of shoreline we could reasonably cover on foot before full dark made it too dangerous to keep moving. I was paired up with another volunteer, the guy who'd apparently worked that specific lake before on a different call-out years earlier, and he was noticeably quieter than usual the whole drive in, staring out the window instead of making the usual small talk we normally did on the way to a scene, which I didn't think much of at the time beyond assuming he was just focused. We were assigned a stretch of shoreline to walk together, checking for any sign of the missing person, clothing, footprints, disturbed brush, anything at all that might be useful for command to work with. About 20 minutes into the walk, my partner stopped cold and told me, flatly, without much preamble, that this was the same lake from a call-out he'd worked 3 years earlier, a search that had never turned up a body, never fully got closed out the way these things usually do, just quietly stopped getting resources funneled to it after a few weeks of nothing. He said the family had eventually accepted it and moved on with their lives the way families have to, but he never fully had. Not really, because something about that earlier search had felt wrong to him the whole time he was out on it, and he wouldn't specify what he meant by wrong, no matter how I asked him to clarify. We kept walking anyway, headlamps on now as the light faded fast. My partner mentioned, almost offhand, that the earlier search 3 years back had also turned up a similar drag mark in roughly the same stretch of shoreline, close enough to where we were standing now that he actually stopped and paced it off against his memory before deciding it probably wasn't the exact same spot, just close, which somehow didn't make me feel any better about it. The seed detail I noticed myself, without my partner pointing it out. At one point, we crossed a stretch of shoreline where the mud was disturbed in a long straight line, like something heavy had been dragged from the waterline up into the tree line. And then, this was the part that stuck with me. Dragged back down again afterward, like whatever made the track had changed its mind halfway through and reversed course. My partner looked at it for a long, silent moment and didn't say a word about it, just kept walking, noticeably faster than before, his light sweeping the tree line more than it needed to. About an hour into the search, full dark now, we both heard something that sounded like a person calling out, far off across the open water. Not clear words exactly, more like a long drawn-out sound that could have been someone calling for help, or could have just been nothing at all, carrying strangely across still water, the way sound sometimes does at night when there's no wind to break it up. We radioed it in immediately. Command had us hold our position and listen closely for a repeat. Standard procedure. It didn't repeat, not in the same way, but about 10 minutes later we both heard something much closer, less like a call for help this time, and more like a single low word. right at the very edge of what a human voice could actually produce, coming from somewhere near that same stretch of mud where the drag mark had been. Neither of us said much to each other in the minutes right after we heard it, which in itself was unusual, because normally on a call-out you talk through everything out loud with your partner as a way of processing it and staying oriented. This time we just stood there, lights off by unspoken agreement, listening to the water go quiet again the way it had been before. And I remember being acutely aware of how loud my own breathing sounded to me in that silence, like it was the only sound left in the world. I want to be clear that we did everything by the book from that point forward. We didn't chase a sound alone in the dark. We held our position exactly as instructed. We reported everything precisely as we heard it, and eventually a second team was routed in to properly sweep that specific section. They found nothing when they got there. No footprints beyond the one drag mark we'd already flagged. No clothing, no torn brush. Nothing at all to suggest anyone, living or otherwise, had actually been through that stretch of shoreline recently, despite what we'd both just heard less than half an hour before. The original missing swimmer from that night was never found. Not that night, and not in the days that followed. The search wound down officially after 4 days. Same length of time, same quiet loss of resources as my partner's earlier search 3 years before had apparently gone through as well. 2 open, unresolved cases on the exact same short stretch of lakeshore. 3 years apart, almost to the season, both ending the same unresolved way with nothing to show for it. When I mentioned the coincidence to our team lead afterward, half expecting him to brush it off the way command usually brushed off anything that didn't fit neatly into a report, he just went quiet for a second and said he'd actually pulled the old file on that first search before assigning us out there, and hadn't planned on mentioning why until I brought it up myself. Command logged the sound we heard as unconfirmed, possibly wildlife, which is the standard phrase for anything that can't be pinned down to something concrete, and I understand why they wrote it that way, but neither my partner nor I ever fully believed it ourselves. He told me, driving back that night, that the sound from 3 years earlier had been logged the exact same way, word for word, and that some part of him had been half expecting to hear it again the moment command assigned him to that same lake a second time, like he'd known all along it was only a matter of time before he got sent back. My partner put in for a transfer to a different sector not long after that call-out, moved his volunteer hours over to land searches almost exclusively. From what I've heard since, he's never said outright that it was because of that specific night, but he's also never worked a water call-out again, as far as I know in the years since, and whenever I've brought that particular lake up in conversation since then, even just in passing, he changes the subject fast enough that I've stopped bringing it up entirely. I still don't know what actually dragged that line through the mud that night, or which direction it was really moving in when it finally did, or whether it's still out there, dragging the same line 3 years from now. For whoever gets sent to that lake next, that's all 7 for tonight. If any of these felt a little too close to a lake you know, that's probably just the fog talking, or it isn't. And either way, I hope you sleep a little easier tonight than some of the people in these stories did. If you're still here, still watching the build go up in the background, thank you for sticking around. It genuinely means more than you'd think, especially this late. Drop a sub if you want more of these down the line. No pressure either way, and I'll see you next time.